The relentless howls shattered the midnight silence. Officer Jake froze. His K-9 partner, Shadow, never behaved this way. But tonight, something was wrong. The echoes carried a truth buried beneath the cold earth, one that would change everything. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine as Officer Jake Reynolds tightened his grip on the leash. Shadow, his K-9 partner, had never acted this way before. The dog's ears were stiff, his body rigid, every muscle coiled like a spring ready to snap. His howl had echoed through the quiet forest, a haunting wail that sent a shiver down Jake's spine. Shadow was trained for precision, obedience, and control. He never howled without reason. Jake exhaled, his breath curling into the cold night. His patrol shift had been routine until now. The rural town barely saw any real crime, but tonight felt different. The stars were swallowed by thick clouds, and the wind whispered through the trees like a warning. Shadow's leash trembled in Jake's hands as the dog strained forward, his black and tan fur bristling. "What is it, boy?" Jake murmured, scanning the darkness ahead. The flashlight's beam cut through the night, illuminating nothing but the path ahead, a trail of packed dirt winding deeper into the woods. Shadow growled, low and guttural, the sound vibrating through Jake's chest. It had been years since he'd heard Shadow growl like that. The last time was during a drug bust gone wrong, when a suspect pulled a knife from his boot. Shadow had lunged without hesitation, his instincts honed to protect. But this? This was something else entirely. Jake's hand found the small, worn-out badge clipped to his belt. It wasn't his usual police badge. It was his father's, a relic from a man he had spent his whole life chasing, but never catching. His father had been a decorated officer, one of the best K-9 handlers in the force, until the night he disappeared without a trace. Jake had kept the badge ever since, a reminder of the ghost he still hunted. He knelt beside Shadow, running a steady hand over the dog's thick fur. Shadow's heart was pounding, his breath sharp and urgent. Jake's own pulse quickened in response. Something was out there. The forest had swallowed its fair share of secrets. Missing hikers, lost animals, the occasional runaway seeking solitude. But tonight, there was an unshakable weight in the air, a presence lurking just beyond reach. A crack echoed through the trees, not the whisper of shifting leaves, but something deliberate. A footstep. Jake snapped his head up, his hand instinctively moving to the grip of his holstered gun. Shadow let out a sharp, whining bark, his front paws digging into the earth as if begging to be released. Then, the wind carried something else, a scent. Shadow inhaled deeply, his body trembling with urgency. And then he bolted. Jake barely had time to react as the leash yanked through his fingers, and Shadow disappeared into the black void of the woods. His heart slammed against his ribs as he chased after him, the flashlight bouncing wildly in his grasp. The night closed in, and somewhere in the distance, Shadow's howls returned. But this time, they weren't just a warning. They were a cry for help. Jake's boots pounded against the damp earth as he sprinted after Shadow. The dog's howls echoed through the dense trees, each one filled with an urgency that sent adrenaline surging through Jake's veins. He pushed forward, his breath coming in sharp gasps, the flashlight trembling in his grasp as he swung it across the path. Shadow was ahead, barely visible in the shifting darkness, his powerful legs carrying him toward something unseen. Then, suddenly, silence. Jake skidded to a stop, his pulse hammering. Shadow was gone. The night swallowed everything, his dog, his breath, even the sound of his own pounding heart. He turned in a slow circle, sweeping the flashlight in all directions. The shadows seemed to twist and breathe around him, the towering trees casting eerie figures against the gloom. "Shadow!" he called, his voice tight with worry. No response. Jake swallowed hard, instincts screaming at him to be careful. Shadow was trained to respond, to never stray too far without a signal. But tonight, something had drawn him into the unknown, something powerful enough to make the dog abandon all protocol. Jake took a cautious step forward. The earth felt different beneath his boots, softer, damp, almost disturbed. The scent in the air had shifted too. the crisp pine overtaken by something faintly metallic. Blood. Jake's fingers tightened around his gun. He followed the scent, his steps slower now, deliberate. His flashlight traced the ground until it landed on something unnatural, a deep impression in the earth, claw marks carved into the dirt as if something had been dragged. A heavy lump formed in his throat. Then another sound cut through the quiet. Not Shadow's howl this time, but something else entirely. A whisper, low, raspy, like breath struggling to escape a throat too weak to call for help. Jake's chest tightened. His flashlight jerked toward the sound, illuminating a clearing just beyond the trees. And there, slumped against the roots of an ancient oak, was a figure. A man, barely conscious, blood trailing from a wound on his forehead. His clothes were torn, mud streaked across his arms. He looked as though he had been running from something far worse than the night itself. Jake's breath caught as Shadow appeared beside the man, standing guard, his deep brown eyes fixed on Jake as if saying, "I found him. Now do something." Jake holstered his gun and rushed forward, his mind already racing through the possibilities. Who was this man? How had he ended up out here, alone, bleeding, and, more terrifyingly, what had he been running from? Jake dropped to one knee, his breath still uneven from the chase. Shadow stood unmoving, his body rigid, eyes locked onto Jake as if waiting for orders. The man slumped against the oak tree, barely stirred, his chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged breaths. "Hey," Jake said, his voice firm but calm. "Can you hear me?" The man's lips parted, but only a faint rasp came out. Up close, Jake could see the extent of his injuries. Deep scratches ran across his arms like he had clawed through thorns, or worse. His clothes were torn, soaked in sweat and dirt, his face pale beneath the streaks of blood. Jake reached for his radio, fingers tightening around the cold metal. "Dispatch, this is Officer Reynolds. I have an injured male, unresponsive but breathing. I need medical." A weak grip latched onto his wrist. Jake tensed. The man's fingers were ice cold, trembling as they clutched onto him with surprising desperation. "No. Cops," the man rasped, barely audible. His eyes, dull with exhaustion, flickered with something else. Fear. Jake frowned. "You're hurt. You need a hospital." The man shook his head weakly, panic flashing across his face. "They'll find me." Jake's gut tightened. This wasn't just a lost hiker. This was something more. He studied the man's injuries again, not just random scratches, but defensive wounds. Whatever had happened to him, he had fought back. "Who?" Jake pressed. "Who's after you?" The man's breathing hitched. His gaze darted beyond Jake, into the darkness of the forest. "Not safe. They'll hear." Shadow let out a low, guttural growl. The hairs on Jake's arms stood on end. Shadow wasn't growling at the man. He was growling at something behind them. Jake's grip instinctively shifted to his gun. He turned, scanning the trees, but the darkness was suffocating. His flashlight cut through the gloom, illuminating twisted branches and shifting shadows, but nothing else. Then, movement. A branch snapped, sharp and deliberate. Jake rose to his feet, his entire body tense. The air felt wrong, heavy, charged with an invisible presence. He had been a cop long enough to know when he was being watched. Shadow's growl deepened, his ears pinned back, his body angled protectively in front of Jake and the injured man. The forest held its breath. Then, silence. Not just the absence of immediate noise, but an unnatural stillness. The wind had stopped. The usual rustling of nocturnal life had vanished. Even the trees seemed frozen in place. Jake's heart pounded. Something was out there. Something was listening. "Shadow, heal," Jake murmured, his voice steady despite the adrenaline crashing through his system. Shadow obeyed, stepping closer, his growl turning into a low whine, uneasy, uncertain. Jake turned back to the man. "Can you walk?" The man swallowed hard, nodding despite the obvious pain racking his body. "Then we're getting out of here, now." He hauled the man to his feet, looping the stranger's arm over his shoulder to support his weight. The guy barely had the strength to stand, but he forced himself forward. Jake kept his gun drawn, scanning the darkness with every step. The trees felt taller, the forest deeper than before, like the very ground beneath them had shifted, pulling them further away from safety. Then, a sound. Not a growl, not a voice. A whistle. Low, melodic. A haunting tune that drifted through the trees. Jake froze. Shadow pressed against his leg, his body shaking. The whistle didn't come from one direction. It came from everywhere. Jake's grip on his gun tightened. The whistle slithered through the trees, a sound both distant and impossibly close, as if the forest itself was breathing it out. The man beside him stiffened, his entire body trembling. "They found me," he whispered. "Oh God, they found me." Jake didn't wait for an explanation. They needed to move. "Let's go," he ordered, pushing forward. The dirt path they had come from was gone, swallowed by the ever-shifting forest, but Jake knew the general direction of the patrol car. If they could make it back to the main road, they could get the hell out of here. The whistling grew louder. It wasn't a single tune anymore. It was an answer. Jake's pulse thundered in his ears. He scanned the trees, but the darkness refused to give up its secrets. Whatever was out there, it wasn't human. Not completely. Shadow whined again, his body trembling against Jake's leg. He had never seen his partner this afraid. Not during gunfire, not during takedowns. Never. Then another noise. A voice. Right behind him. "You shouldn't have come here." Jake whipped around, gun raised. Nothing. But he had heard it. A whisper just above the wind. The man beside him was hyperventilating, his breath coming in rapid, panicked gasps. "They don't like outsiders," he choked out. "They never let anyone leave." Jake's gut twisted. He had no idea what the man was talking about, but he had seen enough horror in his career to know when someone wasn't lying. "Move," Jake urged. Then, a shadow moved. Not a shadow. The shadows. They shifted, crawling along the trees like living things. Shapes formed where there should be nothing. A flicker of something inhuman. Jake fired. The shot cracked through the silence, the echo bouncing between the trees. The shadows didn't react, but the whistling stopped. Then, the forest screamed. A deafening shriek, high-pitched and wrong, like the sound of something ancient being disturbed. The trees trembled. The very ground beneath them seemed to groan. Shadow barked wildly, his body pressed to Jake's leg, as if trying to keep him grounded. Then, the man in Jake's grip went rigid. Jake turned just in time to see the stranger's eyes roll back, his mouth opening in a silent scream. His body convulsed, limbs jerking violently. Then, he wasn't there anymore. Jake stumbled back. The man had been right beside him. Then he wasn't. Gone. Not a sound, not a trace. Jake's breath came in short, uneven gasps. This wasn't possible. Shadow whimpered. Jake turned, trying to find the path, any path. But the forest had closed in. The trees loomed closer, their trunks impossibly dense. The night itself had thickened, pressing against his skin like an unseen force. Then, from deep within the dark, laughter. Software, amused. And then, the whistle returned. Jake did the only thing he could. He ran. Shadow stayed at his side, both of them pushing through the impossible thickness of the trees. The laughter followed. The whistle danced between the branches. Jake didn't look back. The patrol car had to be close. It had to be. Then, light. Not the eerie glow of whatever hunted them, but something real. Headlights, the road, safety. Jake burst from the trees, his boots slamming onto solid pavement. He turned, chest heaving, and the forest was normal, quiet, still, like nothing had happened. Shadow panted beside him, shaking. Jake turned toward his patrol car, hands still trembling. He reached for his radio, but he already knew. No one would believe him. Not yet, because whatever had taken that man wasn't done with him. Jake leaned against the hood of his patrol car, trying to steady his breathing. The engine was still running, its soft hum the only real sound in the suffocating silence of the night. His radio crackled, dispatch checking in. He didn't answer. His hands trembled as he rubbed his face, his mind refusing to accept what had just happened. The man, gone. Not dead, just erased, as if he had never been there at all. Shadow whined at his feet, his body pressed close to Jake's leg. The dog was still shaking. That scared Jake more than anything. Shadow wasn't just trained to be fearless. He had seen everything. Gunfire, explosions, high-speed pursuits. Nothing rattled him. Until tonight. Jake finally reached for the radio, his voice rough. "Dispatch, this is Officer Reynolds. I lost the suspect. Area is clear." A pause. Then, "Copy that, Reynolds. Need backup?" He almost said yes. Almost begged them to send every available unit. But what would he even tell them? That the trees had swallowed a man whole? That shadows moved like living things? "No," he said finally. "I'm heading back." He cut the radio before they could respond. Sliding into the driver's seat, he forced himself to take deep breaths. The patrol car was a small, enclosed space, safe, familiar. He gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Shadow curled up in the passenger seat, still restless. Jake reached over, scratching behind his ears. "I know, boy," he murmured. "I saw it too." As he pulled onto the road, the headlights carved through the dense trees. Everything looked normal, too normal. But something was missing. Jake's stomach twisted as he realized the forest was silent. No insects, no night birds, no rustling of branches, just a vast, empty void pressing against his car. It stayed that way until he reached town. Jake pulled into the station, the fluorescent lights feeling harsher than usual. He barely noticed the other officers as he strode toward his desk, Shadow padding silently beside him. His partner, Officer Maddox, leaned back in his chair, sipping coffee. "Rough night?" he asked, nodding at Jake's dirt-streaked uniform. Jake hesitated. "Yeah, something like that." Maddox raised an eyebrow but didn't push. Jake sat, staring at his computer screen without really seeing it. His mind was still in the woods, still hearing that whistle. He needed answers. His fingers flew over the keyboard, pulling up reports from the last 10 years. Missing persons, lost hikers, campers, drifters, people who had simply vanished near those woods. The list was long, too long. A pattern emerged. All disappearances happened near the old logging road. No bodies, no evidence, just gone. Jake's pulse quickened. Then he saw a familiar name. Reynolds, Daniel. His breath caught. His father. Jake leaned against the hood of his patrol car, trying to steady his breathing. The engine was still running, its soft hum the only real sound in the suffocating silence of the night. His radio crackled, dispatch checking in. He didn't answer. His hands trembled as he rubbed his face, his mind refusing to accept what had just happened. The man. Gone. Not dead, just erased. As if he had never been there at all. Shadow whined at his feet, his body pressed close to Jake's leg. The dog was still shaking. That scared Jake more than anything. Shadow wasn't just trained to be fearless, he had seen everything. Gunfire, explosions, high-speed pursuits. Nothing rattled him. Until tonight. Jake finally reached for the radio, his voice rough. "Dispatch, this is Officer Reynolds. I lost the suspect. Area is clear." A pause. Then, "Copy that, Reynolds. Need backup?" He almost said yes. Almost begged them to send every available unit. But what would he even tell them? That the trees had swallowed a man whole? That shadows moved like living things? "No," he said finally. "I'm heading back." He cut the radio before they could respond. Sliding into the driver's seat, he forced himself to take deep breaths. The patrol car was a small, enclosed space, safe, familiar. He gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Shadow curled up in the passenger seat, still restless. Jake reached over, scratching behind his ears. "I know, boy," he murmured. "I saw it too." As he pulled onto the road, the headlights carved through the dense trees. Everything looked normal. Too normal. But something was missing. Jake's stomach twisted as he realized the forest was silent. No insects, no night birds, no rustling of branches, just a vast empty void pressing against his car. It stayed that way until he reached town. Jake pulled into the station, the fluorescent lights feeling harsher than usual. He barely noticed the other officers as he strode toward his desk, Shadow padding silently beside him. His partner, Officer Maddox, leaned back in his chair, sipping coffee. "Rough night?" he asked, nodding at Jake's dirt-streaked uniform. Jake hesitated. "Yeah, something like that." Maddox raised an eyebrow but didn't push. Jake sat, staring at his computer screen without really seeing it. His mind was still in the woods, still hearing that whistle. He needed answers. His fingers flew over the keyboard, pulling up reports from the last 10 years. Missing persons, lost hikers, campers, drifters, people who had simply vanished near those woods. The list was long, too long. A pattern emerged. All disappearances happened near the old logging road. No bodies, no evidence. Just gone. Jake's pulse quickened. Then he saw a familiar name. Reynolds, Daniel. His breath caught. His father. Part 2, 1,000 words. Jake's vision blurred as he stared at the name. He had spent his whole life trying to piece together what happened to his father. Now the answer was right here. His father had disappeared 30 years ago, vanished while on duty. The official report was vague. Last seen near the old logging road. No body was ever found, no leads. Until now. Jake's hands clenched into fists. This wasn't coincidence. The same thing that took that man tonight took his father. Maddox noticed the shift in Jake's expression. "You good, man?" Jake hesitated, then shut the laptop. "Yeah." He wasn't about to tell Maddox the truth, not yet. But he knew what he had to do. He was going back. An hour later, Jake stood at the edge of the woods, his patrol car parked behind him. The flashlight in his grip felt useless against the oppressive darkness. Shadow stood beside him, ears perked, body tense. Jake exhaled slowly. "Let's finish this." He stepped into the trees. At first, the forest was just a forest, the same damp earth, the same scent of pine. But the deeper he went, the heavier the air became. It pressed against his skin, thick and suffocating. Shadow growled low. Jake gritted his teeth and pressed forward. He wasn't leaving without answers. Then, the first sign. A footprint. Jake knelt, brushing dirt away. It was fresh. Boots. Someone had been here. Then another, and another. A trail leading deeper. Jake followed. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. Minutes passed. Then, a sound. Not the whistle, a voice, faint, desperate. "Help me." Jake's stomach dropped. It was his father's voice. He turned, flashlight darting through the trees. "Dad?" Silence. Shadow whimpered. Then, the whistle returned. This time, it was closer. Jake's breath came fast. His gun was already in his hands. Something was behind him. Slowly, he turned. And the trees moved. Not the branches, the trunks. They twisted, contorting, as if something inside them was shifting. Then, a figure emerged. At first, Jake thought it was a man. Tall, broad shoulders. But as it stepped forward, the shape changed. Too long. Limbs that didn't move right. A face that wasn't quite a face. The shadows bent around it. Part of it. It raised one finger. Bony. Too many joints. And it pointed at Jake. Jake's body locked up. His breath hitched. Then, the whisper, low, ancient. "You shouldn't have come back." Jake's blood turned ice cold. The figure tilted its head, watching, studying. Jake squeezed the trigger. The gunshot shattered the silence, but the figure didn't flinch. It only smiled. Then, the world went dark. Jake's world collapsed into darkness. Not the absence of light, but something deeper, thicker. A void. He wasn't unconscious. He could feel the damp earth beneath him, hear the soft rustling of unseen things moving in the distance. But when he opened his eyes, there was nothing. No trees, no sky, no shadow, just an endless blackness stretching in all directions. His heart hammered against his ribs. He forced himself to breathe, to think. The last thing he remembered was shooting. The figure had smiled, and then a whisper. Jake stiffened. It was close, right behind him. "You came looking, didn't you?" The voice was wrong, too familiar. Slowly, Jake turned. A shape stood before him, tall, obscured by the shifting blackness, its edges flickering like a glitch in reality. Then, it changed. His father stood in front of him. Jake's breath caught. "Dad?" Daniel Reynolds's face was the same as Jake remembered from old photos. Square jaw, sharp eyes, the faintest trace of a smile, but something was off. His movements weren't quite right, too smooth, too deliberate. Jake's gut twisted. "This isn't real," he muttered. Daniel tilted his head, just like the figure had before everything went dark. "You still don't understand, do you?" Jake took a slow step back, his boots sinking into the unseen ground. "Where am I?" His father's expression didn't change. "Where they bring the ones who ask too many questions." Jake swallowed hard. "Who are they?" The darkness shifted. Shapes moved at the edges of his vision, figures standing just outside the reach of his mind, watching. "Old things," Daniel murmured. "Things that don't like to be disturbed." Jake's hands clenched. He still had his gun. He could feel the cool metal at his hip. But what good was a weapon in a place like this? "Is this what happened to you?" Jake asked, his voice quieter. "Did they take you?" Daniel's expression didn't flicker. "I came looking, just like you, and they kept me." A lump formed in Jake's throat. His whole life had been shaped by his father's absence. He had chased this moment, the answers, the truth. But now that it was here, it felt wrong. His father took a step forward. "Jake," he said softly, "you can stay. You don't have to fight anymore." Jake flinched. Daniel reached out a hand, and Jake saw it. His fingers weren't fingers, too long, too thin, twisting at the ends like roots. Jake's stomach dropped. This wasn't his father. His body moved before his mind caught up. He grabbed his gun, aimed at Daniel's chest, and fired. The gunshot exploded through the void. Daniel didn't move. Then, he smiled. The bullet had done nothing. Jake's chest tightened. Daniel sighed. "You always were stubborn." Then, the darkness broke. It cracked like glass, shattering around him in 1,000 twisting fragments of light and shadow. And suddenly, Jake was falling. The wind roared in his ears. His body plunged through the abyss, weightless, breathless. Panic clawed at his throat. He reached for anything. Then, cold, hard ground. Jake gasped, his lungs burning as if he had been holding his breath for hours. His body ached, his head spun. And above him, the forest, the sky, the trees. Jake blinked rapidly, chest heaving. He was back. Shadow barked somewhere close by, the sound frantic, desperate. Jake rolled onto his side, his fingers clawing at the earth as reality solidified around him. The whistle was gone. The whispers were gone. Jake pushed himself upright, his heart still hammering. The woods looked different, smaller, like they had lost their grip on him. Shadow bounded toward him, his body pressing against Jake's, as if grounding him in the real world. Jake buried his hands in the dog's fur. "Good boy," he rasped, voice raw. "Good boy." Then, movement. Jake's breath caught. He snapped his head up, gun still clutched in his hand. But it wasn't them. It was a man, slumped against a tree. bloodied, weak, but alive. The same man who had vanished. Jake's stomach twisted. He scrambled to his feet, rushing forward. "Hey!" The man's eyes fluttered open, and he whispered, "They let me go." Jake's blood ran cold, because as he looked closer, he realized something was wrong. The man was different. His eyes. They weren't the same ones Jake had seen before. Something else was looking out from behind them, and it was watching. His body twitched. His head jerked to the side as if he had just been mildly inconvenienced. Then, slowly, he turned his gaze back to Jake. "You don't get to leave." Jake didn't hesitate. "Shadow, go." The dog released his grip and ran. Jake bolted after him, his boots slamming against the earth as the air around them seemed to warp. The trees shifted, their branches reaching like grasping fingers. The whistle returned, but this time it wasn't behind him. It was inside his own skull. He gritted his teeth, fighting the urge to listen, to stop. But then, light. His patrol car. The road. Safety. Jake burst from the tree line, gasping for breath as he stumbled onto the pavement. Shadow was already there, circling the vehicle anxiously. Jake yanked the door open and practically threw himself inside, slamming it shut behind him. His fingers fumbled for the ignition. Then, he looked up. The man was standing at the edge of the forest, not chasing, not running, waiting. The trees behind him shifted, swallowing his form back into the dark. And then, he was gone. The woods exhaled, the wind returned, the stars flickered back to life. Everything was normal again. Except it wasn't. Jake's hands were still shaking as he finally turned the key. The engine roared to life. He didn't wait. He drove. Jake's hands gripped the steering wheel like a lifeline as he sped down the empty highway. The town lights were still miles away, but he didn't stop. Shadow sat rigid in the passenger seat, his body tense, his ears pinned back. He hadn't made a sound since they left. Jake's mind raced. What the hell had just happened? The man should have been dead. No one could take a bullet like that and keep moving. And those words, "You found what they left for you." Jake's stomach twisted. His father, the others, were they still in there? His phone buzzed. Jake nearly jumped out of his skin. With one hand still on the wheel, he fished it out of his jacket. Unknown number. His throat went dry. He let it ring. It stopped. Then, a voicemail. Jake's fingers hovered over the play button. Every instinct told him not to listen, but he did. A static hiss filled the car. Then, breathing. Slow. Shallow. And then, a voice. Jake. His blood ran cold. Because it was his father's voice. Not from an old recording. Not from a memory. It was fresh. Recent. And then, "Don't come back." The message cut off. Jake barely noticed when he veered onto his street. His house was dark, just as he left it. The second the engine died, Shadow leaped out, circling the yard, sniffing the air. Jake's fingers still trembled as he stepped out. The world felt off balance. He barely made it inside before he locked every door. His mind was a hurricane. The voicemail played on repeat in his head. He sat heavily on the couch, head in his hands. Shadow whined softly, nudging his knee. Jake exhaled. "I know, buddy." His fingers brushed against something in his pocket. He frowned, pulling it out. His father's badge. But it wasn't how he had left it. The surface was scratched, worn, as if it had been left outside for years. Jake's pulse pounded. He had been holding it the whole time. And yet, there, etched into the metal, were two new words. Still here. Jake's breath hitched. The badge felt wrong in his palm, colder than metal should be. Shadow let out a sharp, panicked bark. The lights flickered. Jake's skin prickled. He turned just in time to see a shadow, not his, standing in the hallway, watching. Then, darkness. The room plunged into darkness. Jake's breath hitched. His body tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun. The familiar weight of the weapon grounded him, but deep inside, he knew. A bullet wouldn't fix this. Shadow was growling low, his body pressed against Jake's leg, ears pinned back. The shadow in the hallway wasn't moving. It just stood there, watching. Jake's pulse thundered in his ears. His father's badge sat ice-cold in his palm. The words, "Still here," etched into the metal. He forced himself to breathe. "Who are you?" he demanded, voice rough. The air in the house shifted, the temperature dropping. The darkness deepened, thick and suffocating. Then, a whisper. Not from the figure, from the badge. Jake's grip tightened as the whisper coiled through his mind like a snake. "You already know." A flicker of movement. The shadow stepped forward. Jake snapped his gun up. "Stop." It did. And then, finally, it spoke. "I never left." Jake's breath caught. The voice was familiar. Too familiar. Low. Rough. His father's voice. The whisper returned, curling around his thoughts like a hand pressed against his skull. "You searched for me," it murmured. "Now you see." The shadows shivered, like static on an old television. The figure's shape was wrong. Its body flickered between human and something else. Jake's chest tightened. He had spent his whole life searching for the truth. And now, it had found him first. "You're not him," Jake said through clenched teeth. "You're something else." Silence. Then, laughter. Not from the figure. From everywhere. It rippled through the air, a chorus of voices that weren't human. Some deep and guttural, others thin and high, overlapping in a sound that made Jake's skin crawl. The shadow in the hallway twisted. Then, it was gone. The lights flickered back to life. The house was empty, but the air still felt wrong, like something unseen was lingering, just out of reach. Shadow let out a small, uncertain whine. Jake forced himself to move. His body felt stiff, as if he had been standing there for hours. His phone was still clutched in his free hand. The voicemail from the unknown number sat on the screen, waiting. He hesitated. Then, deleted it. Some things weren't meant to be heard twice. The next morning, Jake sat at his desk in the station, staring at the missing persons file. His father's name stared back at him. So did dozens of others. People who had vanished near those woods. People who had never come back. Except now, one had. Or at least, something wearing his skin had. Maddox dropped a cup of coffee in front of him, raising an eyebrow. "You look like hell, Reynolds." Jake exhaled, rubbing his eyes. "Feel like it too." Maddox leaned against the desk, taking a sip of his own coffee. "So, that guy you found, the one who vanished?" Jake's stomach twisted. He hadn't told anyone what really happened. "What about him?" he asked carefully. Maddox shrugged. "Vanished again." Jake's grip tightened on the badge in his pocket. "What?" "Yeah," Maddox said. "Hospital called this morning. He was there, totally unresponsive, just staring at the ceiling all night. Then, around 4 a.m., gone. Security footage shows him getting up and walking out. No one stopped him. No one even saw him leave." Jake felt a chill creep up his spine. It wasn't over. Maddox sipped his coffee, oblivious to Jake's thoughts. Maybe he just didn't want the medical bill. Jake forced a smirk. Yeah, maybe. But deep down, he knew. Something let him go, and it wasn't finished with Jake yet. That night, Jake sat in his patrol car outside the station, gripping his father's badge in one hand. Shadow sat beside him, silent. Waiting. Jake exhaled. Then, without another thought, he put the car in drive and headed back toward the woods. Some questions are never meant to be answered. Some roads should never be traveled twice. But Jake Reynolds isn't done searching, and neither are they. Would you have gone back? Would you have stopped when the warning came? Or would you have chased the truth no matter the cost? Let me know in the comments what you would have done. If you enjoyed this story, hit the like button and subscribe for more chilling mysteries. Turn on notifications so you never miss what's lurking just beyond the dark. because sometimes the things we leave behind don't stay behind.